Welcome to our discussion of JavaScript, a scripting language for the World Wide Web. Let's begin. A little bit about JavaScript. Really, JavaScript is just a programming language. Specifically, it's a type of programming language called a scripting language. It's written at a high level, and it's what we call interpreted. If you have an HTML page with JavaScript code and it's loaded into a web browser, each line of code will be executed one at a time as your page is either being loaded or as needed. JavaScript can be embedded into other programs like HTML documents, and some other examples of scripting languages include active server pages or ASP, PHP, Perl, or Python. JavaScript adds interactivity to web pages, and that's what we're going to concentrate on with what we're doing today. And there's also no license required. It's a free product, and every major browser has a JavaScript interpreter built right in. So what can JavaScript do? JavaScript can do a variety of different things. And as I mentioned, we're going to concentrate on the dynamic aspect of JavaScript. The ability to add JavaScript code to web pages to make them more dynamic, to be able to respond to different events like button clicks. But you can also use JavaScript to detect which type of browser is viewing the page. You can use it to validate data that's entered into a form, and you can use it to create and manage cookies, which are small little files that your browser produces and maintains to help track where you're going, or perhaps to implement a shopping cart. There are three main ways we can use JavaScript, and in some ways it's similar to what you may have seen with CSS. JavaScript code can be placed into the head section of an HTML document. It can be written inline in an HTML program, or it can be placed in a separate file with a .js extension, in other words an external file, and called from your HTML document. In the following slides we're going to see a variety of different examples. It's important for you to know that all the following code examples can be found via this one URL. There will be links at this page to every one of the code samples we're going to be looking at today. It might be a good idea to pause this presentation and type this URL into your browser so you can follow along. Remember that you can always view the source of your documents, and that can be helpful in what we're about to see. Here's a simple HTML document like we've previously created. A simple HTML document with a head section and a body section. In this case, the only thing in the body is an H1 element. The H1 element just simply says Hello World. It's a very simple page, and it even has some CSS style to center the words Hello World on the screen. But what if we want to do something similar in JavaScript? Remember that JavaScript is not a standalone thing. We're going to embed it within our HTML document. So here's what that would look like. The example we're seeing here is an example of inline JavaScript. What we've done is we've replaced the H1 element in our body section with a script. We have a script element in HTML5, and you see it here between the body tags. Script followed by the type attribute, for which we specify text/JavaScript to indicate that what follows is JavaScript code. Between the script and end script tags is the JavaScript code. JavaScript uses what's called the document object model. Within your HTML page, it's organized through this idea of elements, some nested within others. The document object model is just a tool by which we can access these individual pieces, as well as some additional functionality. Here you see a line of JavaScript code starting with document.write. What it's saying is go to the current document, in other words your HTML page, specifically your body section, and write into it whatever follows there in parentheses. Now what's in parentheses is actually an HTML snippet. So this is actually written into the page as the page is being loaded by your browser. So this is just really having the same effect as the previous page. It's just using JavaScript to generate the HTML. Now from this simple example we can expand this a little bit, and we will. But here's an example if we wanted to do the same thing in the head section. Notice here in this particular example there is nothing in the body. In the head section, we have our script tags. We have our JavaScript code between those script tags. Again, when the page is loaded, you will see the words Hello World centered on the page with H1 formatting. Remember, at the top of each of these slides, you'll see a file name. If you go to that URL I mentioned earlier on, you'll see a link to this file. Feel free to check it out, examine the source code, and see what you see here. Our next file, simplejs3, changes it up a bit. We still have a script in the head section, but remember earlier I said that JavaScript allows us to respond to events. When your page is loaded into the browser, an event is triggered. Events are things that happen that someone may want to respond to. In this example, the event that we're responding to is the load event. When a page is loaded, it triggers an event. And if you see down at the body tag, we have an attribute called onLoad. This means that when the page is being loaded, you can add code to respond to that. In this case, we say onLoad equals, and then in double quotes, what we call a function call. What we're doing here is calling a JavaScript function, which is a grouping of code that we want to execute. Now, if you look at the script tags in the head section, within those two we have something called function message. Message is the name of the function. Function, that keyword, just indicates it is a function. In JavaScript, the function code, the grouping of code we want to execute, is surrounded by these curly braces. The first one begins the code, the second one ends the code. And we see the same thing we saw before, the document.write and then writing in the H1 element. However, we've grouped it together so that if we want to use it, we can use it like we are here with the body tag and the onLoad event. We're calling it, and it's a way of saying, hey, go execute this code for me. It's just another way in which you can do this, something we're going to see again here shortly. Now, we mentioned you can do it inline, you can do it in the head section, you can do it a variety of different ways, but one way we didn't mention yet is the external JS file. Now here you see an example of that. Now again, with CSS you had the idea of an external CSS file. Similar type of idea here. If you look at the head section, we have a script element, and we have an additional attribute called src. Source, kind of like on an img tag. We're specifying a file, and here we have a file called helloworld.js. Notice here that the script elements have nothing between them. What's really the purpose of these script elements is to pull in the code that's found in helloworld.js. By specifying this script element in this manner, it will pull in any code that's found in that file. If you look at the bottom, the file itself is actually very small, and it just contains the JavaScript code that we'd previously seen. There's nothing else in that file. Feel free to check out this file using the link I mentioned previously. Alright, so let's review a few things before we move forward and look at JavaScript with forms. JavaScript code is broken down into what we call statements. If you notice some of the code in the previous examples, you may have noticed that each of those statements ends with a semicolon. The semicolon means end of statement in JavaScript, and it's necessary. JavaScript is also case sensitive, so be careful that you don't mix case. Statements are grouped together in what we call blocks, and this allows a grouping of code to execute together. And we saw that with the function message. We saw the example of the curly braces, one being the begin and one being the end. One thing we're going to see in the examples to follow are something called comments. JavaScript is a programming language, which means that when we write instructions in this language, it's not always the most readable thing in the world to the naked eye. So often we add comments that are simple English-like descriptions of the code that we're writing. These comments start with 2 forward slashes. This identifies to the browser that, hey, this is just a comment, kind of like a note to ourselves, that will be ignored by the interpreter. Now, we mentioned this idea of dynamic web pages, and we saw the onLoad event. There are a variety of different events that we can handle in JavaScript. A mouse click, we saw the onLoad event, or a page or an image loading. When you move a mouse over a hyperlink on a web page, we could respond to that. When you select an input field in an HTML form, like a text box, we could respond to that. One thing we're going to focus on is the idea that when you submit an HTML form, or more specifically, when you hit a button on an HTML form, we can write JavaScript code to respond. We can even use JavaScript code to respond to a keystroke. So here's an example of how to respond to a click event. There are many event handlers that we can use. We saw onLoad. There's also one called onClick. OnClick is most often used with buttons. So if we have something on the form which is a button, input, that element, and then type equals button, we can use the onClick attribute, or more appropriately, the onClick event handler, to do something when the user clicks the button. In this case, if the user clicks the button, the background color of the document is going to go blue. Here we're using JavaScript to make that happen. We're grabbing the document object, and there is what we call a BG color attribute that we set to blue. Now here's an example of something with JavaScript in the onClick event. I encourage you to check out the page listed here, and again, use the URL I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and you'll see a link to simplejs5.html. In this case, we have a simple form. Now the form has a variety of elements. It has a header, an H1. It has a label for a text box which follows, which says please enter your name. And it has a text box with a name of name entry and an ID of name entry. Here the ID is especially important because of the label element which precedes it. With the label element, you notice it has a for attribute. It says for equals name entry. This identifies to the browser that this label, this simple piece of text, is attached to the text box which follows. Now it identifies which text box by using the ID of that text box, in this case name entry. Now the text box, which uses the input element, is of type text, is size 50, meaning it'll be 50 characters wide to give the user enough space to enter their name. And we also have another input element which is of type button. Now here, the size equals 50, it's actually kind of redundant a little bit, but the value says display welcome. This value attribute allows you to specify what the user will see on the button, what text the user will see on the button. So it will say display welcome. The onClick event, has JavaScript code. Now this time it has 2 lines of JavaScript code. Now the onClick attribute, or more appropriately the onClick event handler, when we say onClick equals, what follows in double quotes is JavaScript code. So you'll notice a beginning double quote and an ending double quote further down. There are 2 lines of JavaScript code, 2 statements, both of which end in a semicolon. The 2 forward slashes, remember, mean a comment. They're just a note that we put to ourselves to remind ourselves what that line of code is going to be doing. Now the first line of code is meant to grab the name from the form. Once the user has entered a name on this form in the text box, in the name entry text box, he or she is going to hit the button. Now when that happens, the onClick code is triggered. The first line of code here goes out to the document, goes to our form, which is called simple form, and it's using the name to do that, goes to the name entry part of that form, which is again a text box, and grabs the value. Now the value is what the user has entered into that text box. We're storing that into something called a variable. Now a variable is just really a storage location, something that we can use to temporarily hold a value until we do something with it. Kind of like in algebra, you have variables like x, y, and z, and so on. Here we give our variables descriptive names, like in this case name, because the variable is going to literally hold a name. Now the next line of JavaScript code is meant to pop up a little box on the screen with a welcome message. There's something in JavaScript called alert, which is a function, but what it does is it pops up a little message on the screen that will say welcome, followed by the name, followed by an exclamation point. Now one other thing I want to point out here, because it might be useful for you in this week's assignment, is we have all of our JavaScript code contained within these double quotes, which begin following onClick equals. In the alert line of code, we're using single quotes. That's important because we can't use double quotes here. We have to use single quotes. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. I encourage you to check out this file, play around with it, enter your name, hit the button, see what happens. Here's an example of really the same thing in the head section. Now notice here we've put a function in the head section called welcome, and really all we've done is take those two lines of code we had and move them into this function. This will shorten what we have in the body. If you look at the bottom, for the button, it shortens what we have in the onClick event. We have onClick equals, and then we just have the function call. We call functions by name, so we just say welcome, followed by the empty set of parentheses, followed by the semicolon, which means end of statement. Check this out using the URL I mentioned earlier. Enter your name, click the button, make sure it works the way the previous one did. Well, what happens if we have two text boxes and we want to enter a name in one, and then when we hit the button, have that welcome message appear in the second text box? Well, we can do that using JavaScript. So if you look at this, we have a form, the same form we had before, but we add a second text box and a second label. Now here the text box name is welcome message, and that's its ID as well. So in terms of the JavaScript code, we would just modify that slightly. Instead of using an alert box, we would simply change the second line of JavaScript code to go to the document, and on the document to go to the simple form, and on the simple form to go to the welcome message, which is our text box, and to set the value by assigning it, or using the equal sign here to assign it the values welcome, followed by name, followed by the exclamation point. Again, check this out using the URL I provided before. Type in your name, hit the button, and see the welcome message appear in the other text box. This can be a helpful thing for this week's assignment for you to investigate. This is the end of our presentation, so be sure and review this as well as the textbook chapter this week before you begin the JavaScript assignment.